Hey CSM, we're in the middle of our series on the book of Ephesians. The past 2 weeks, we've been listening to Paul tell us about how we can have a right relationship with God. We talked about how God shows us immense grace in the midst of our sin and brokenness, and how he brings us near to himself, which is great news. We can be close to God. This week, we're going to be spending some time talking about the temple. And no, I'm not talking about the ones in Mesa or Gilbert. We're talking about the temple out in Jerusalem. Why? Because you need to understand why the temple was important and how the temple was laid out to understand the message Paul is trying to communicate to us today. Here is a picture I took on a Central Global trip to Israel last year. This is called the Western Wall. It is the holiest site in all of Judaism because this is what is left of the temple. The largest and lowest stones would have made up a portion of the temple's wall back in Jesus' day. Sadly, it was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, and they tore the whole thing down, and this is all that's left. Before the temple was destroyed, it would have looked something like this. Here is the temple. It is big, it's old, and I promise I'm not going to go all History Channel on you, so hang with me. This is how church used to work for the Israelites each week. This is a top-down diagram of the temple that will show you how the whole place was laid out. And let me explain to you what you're looking at. We're going to start with the outside and work our way in. Keep in mind that the closer you were to the center, the closer you were to God literally. On the outermost edge of the temple is the court of the Gentiles. This is where all the non-Jewish people were allowed to worship God. Even if you believed and loved God, but were a Gentile, this is the only place you were allowed in the entire temple. Next is the court of Israel. This is where all the Jewish women and kids under the age of 13 would have gathered to worship. Closer still is the court of the men of Israel, where all the men over the age of 13 gathered to worship. And then you have the court of the priests, where 23 priests would have been allowed to come in and make offerings to God. And in the very center of the temple is the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God physically dwelt. And once a year, the high priest was allowed to go in and lay face down in the presence of God. In between all of these sections would have been massive dividing walls, making sure people groups stayed in their designated area. People caught going around these barriers to an area they were not allowed were punished with death. Now you may be sitting there thinking, Kyle, this is cool and all, but how does this play out for us today? Let's put this into modern terms. Imagine for a second, we only have one CSM location. It's in Glendale, by the way. And the only way you could experience God was by being at CSM each week. And if you wanted to bring a friend to CSM, the closest they could get was by standing out in the parking lot of the church. And if you are a girl, you can only stand outside the CSM room. And if you're a guy, you can stand in the CSM room. And if you're a guy who have Christian parents, you are allowed to go on stage. And if you're a male student pastor like me, sorry, Rachel and Kate, you can go backstage where the presence of God is, but only once a year. So not only are you driving really far each week, sorry, Queen Creek, but when we arrive, there's nothing but division. There are those who are in and those who are out literally. Everyone is split into different groups. Some of these groups are more popular than others. Some people have more perks than others. Some people are closer to God than others. Some people are more liked than others. And suddenly I'm not describing something that existed thousands of years ago in our imagination. For some of you, I'm describing how each week feels for you. Right now, right here in CSM. Division. Where does this division come from? We see this story of division and fear play out all throughout the Bible. Starting in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve hid from God after they declared they didn't need him by eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The theme continues throughout the countless stories of how the Israelites treated and viewed their neighbors. We see it in the way they worshiped God. And unfortunately, we see it in our own lives today. The division is everywhere. It's on the news, it's on our social media feeds, it's in our group message, it's in our school hallways, and often it's in our church. Let's read Ephesians 2, starting in verse 11. Paul says this, "Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenant of the promise, without hope and without God in the world." A couple of things to point out in this passage. Can you hear the division between these two people groups? The circumcision and the uncircumcised, citizens and non-citizens. You can just hear by his words that these two people groups did not like each other. Secondly, Paul is calling these Gentiles' attention to the fact that at one point in time, these people, like all of us, had no real hope before Jesus. Sometimes we get so caught up on what life looks like right now that we forget where we were before we met Jesus and how we would have been put into a different group. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. By setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations, his purpose was to create in himself one humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. And this is where we see Paul draw attention back to the temple. Look at this picture. These dividing walls are what kept so many people from coming close to God. These dividing walls caused so much pain. And it's the same dividing walls that we create today. We create dividing walls based on our class rankings, whether we play varsity or not, what clubs we are a part of, what school we attend, how much money our parents make, which politicians we vote for. And CSM, all this does is keep people from coming to Jesus. And instead, it creates hostility amongst us. When Jesus died on the cross, he put an end to the division. He put an end to all the hostility, all the violence, all the fear, all the hatred. He put it to death so that we don't have to live that way anymore. There's no us versus them. There's no in versus out. There's just one family living imperfectly in pursuit of a perfect God. Paul goes on to say this, he, Jesus, came and preached peace to you who are far away and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Listen, it doesn't matter who you are, whether this is your first Sunday in church or your 1,000th, whether you said and did all the worst things last week, or if you feel like you followed all the rules, whether you own a Bible or have never even read a Bible, you are loved by God and he wants to give you peace. He wants to give you access to God so that you can have a right relationship with him because he loves you. Paul ends with these words. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. Pastor and theologian Martin Lloyd-Jones explained it this way. The division and the hatred between Jews and Gentiles ran deep. The feud between these two groups had been going on for generations. Their hatred for one another ran deeper than any sports rivalry, deeper than even the hatred we have today between our two political parties. The barrier between these two people groups were so numerous that any thought of Jews and Gentiles being seen together was laughable, let alone kneeling down together and worshiping the same God. And yet, that's exactly what happens in the early church. In cities like Ephesus, we see Jews and Gentiles gathering together, being formed into a new kind of temple, a church to worship God together. So where do we go? How do we get here? Here are 3 ways we can respond to this to become a healthier family so that we can be the church God has called us to be. Number 1, we need to be quick to recognize our own brokenness. I don't know about you, but I am so good at seeing what is wrong with other people. And I am often incredibly slow to identify and admit my own faults. Maybe the step for you is to spend some time asking God to reveal your brokenness, that in his love, he would show you the areas you can grow in. Number 2, maybe you're sitting here this morning and you realize you are broken. You also see how broken everyone else is. Maybe the step you need to take is to receive God's grace. You see, Jesus died for your brokenness. He died for all your mistakes, all the terrible things you have done to yourself and others, and he wants to bring healing and restoration into your life. Number 3, if you're sitting here this morning and you recognize your brokenness, you have made the decision to follow Jesus, then your step is to extend God's love and grace to others, both here in CSM, but then to our families, our schools, our world. God's grace wasn't made to be kept to ourselves. It is good news, and it was been made to share. If this is you this morning, I want you to take a moment, ask God, who needs to hear this good news? And then make the commitment to pray for them, and that God would give you an opportunity to share that good news with them. CSM, we are a family. We are a growing family. Each week, new people are walking through our doors, and how we treat each other matters. How we talk to one another matters. How we think about each other matters. because together God is forming us into a community of people that should bring hope, love, and grace to our communities and everyone who walks through our doors.